Before the letters began arriving in a trickle and then a flood, before the photographs were printed in the Eastern papers, making a legend out of a ghost, there was only the barn. From the dusty track that served as the town's main road, it was an unremarkable structure, a slump-shouldered silhouette against the vast, unforgiving sky. Its timbers were silvered and splintered by years of sun and snow. Its great doors hung slightly askew, held in place by rust and memory. To the people of Hemlock Creek, the barn was an endpoint, a symbol of what had been lost. It was the last remnant of Samuel's ambition, now just a hollow space guarding his young widow's solitude. No one could have imagined what was taking shape within its shadowy quiet. No one could have conceived that the town's most pitiful landmark, a place of sorrow and scrap, was being transformed from the inside out into something akin to a cathedral. A cathedral made of endings. A testament built from the discarded, the broken, and the overlooked. The world would one day marvel at what lay behind those doors, but first, there was only a young woman, a loyal dog, and a growing pile of wood that everyone else in the world considered worthless. It all began in the silence that followed the silence. Annabelle was 25, though the grief she carried was ancient. It had settled into the fine lines around her eyes and the gentle slope of her shoulders. Her husband, Samuel, had been a man of boundless energy and bright, booming laughter, a man who saw this hard-scrabble land not as a place of survival but of promise. He had built their small cabin with his own hands and had raised the frame of the great barn himself, dreaming of a future filled with herds and harvests. Then a fever, swift and merciless, had stolen the sound of his laughter from the world, leaving behind an emptiness so profound it seemed to have its own physical weight. Annabelle moved through her days in that quiet aftermath, the world muted and distant. Her only constant companion was Copper, Samuel's golden retriever, a dog whose sad, knowing eye seemed to hold a reflection of her own sorrow. She was a slight woman, with a cascade of dark hair she kept tied back, and hands that were surprisingly strong, the knuckles calloused from work she had always shared with her husband. Now, the work was hers alone. For a month, she did nothing more than what was necessary. She tended the small vegetable garden, drew water from the well, and mended their clothes, the repetitive motions a poor substitute for comfort. The townsfolk watched her with a mixture of pity and impatience. They saw a woman adrift, a problem to be solved. They offered clumsy condolences and practical, unwanted advice. But they did not understand the nature of her stillness. It was not surrender. It was a listening. A waiting. She was waiting for a reason to move forward, for a purpose to anchor her to the world that had kept spinning after hers had stopped. The answer, when it came, was not in a voice from the heavens or a sign in the clouds. It was in the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass and the scent of pine from the local lumber mill at the edge of town. It was a purpose that smelled like sawdust. The daily ritual began without fanfare, a quiet pilgrimage born of a sudden, inexplicable urge. Each morning, just as the sun began to warm the cool air, Annabelle would leave her cabin, Copper trotting faithfully by her side. She pulled a small, sturdy cart with a squeaking wheel that Mr. Hemlock, her late husband's father, had tried to fix for her twice. The destination was always the same, the lumber mill on the far side of Hemlock Creek. The mill was a place of noise and industry, a stark contrast to the profound quiet of her homestead. Great logs were dragged from the surrounding forests and fed into the screaming teeth of the circular saw, which spat out clean, uniform planks of pine, oak, and cedar. The air was thick with the sharp, clean scent of cut wood, a smell Annabelle had always associated with Samuel's plans, with the scent that clung to his clothes after a day of building. The man who ran the saw, a burly, good-natured fellow named Finn, had known Samuel well. The first time Annabelle appeared with her empty cart, he'd stopped the blade and wiped the sweat from his brow with a dusty forearm, his expression clouded with concern. He assumed she was there for firewood to get through the coming winter. But she walked right past the neat stacks of cordwood and pointed a hesitant finger toward the mountain of refuse behind the mill. It was the scrap pile. The heap of cast-offs. It was a tangle of split ends, warped boards, knot-holed rejects, and thin, bark-edged slabs deemed too imperfect for construction. It was the wood that had failed to be useful. That? Finn had asked, his voice full of confusion. There's no good burning in that. It's all splinters and dust. Annabelle had only nodded, her gaze fixed on the pile. She didn't have the words to explain what she saw. Most people saw trash. Annabelle saw color, the deep, chocolatey brown of a walnut burl, the pale cream of aspen, the reddish blush of cedar. Most people saw flaws. Annabelle saw texture, the swirling grain around a knot, the rough, fibrous edge of a split board, the smooth, water-worn surface of a piece pulled from the riverbank. Most people saw a pile of mistakes. Annabelle saw a palette. Finn, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes, simply shrugged. "Take what you want," he said, waving a generous hand. "Saves me the trouble of burning it." And so, the ritual was established. Every morning, she would arrive, and Finn would give her a silent, questioning nod. She would spend an hour carefully, methodically, picking through the pile. She was not grabbing indiscriminately. She was curating. She would select a piece, turn it over in her hands, feeling its weight and texture, studying its grain as if it were a map. She filled her small cart with these wooden orphans and began the slow, arduous journey home, the squeaking wheel announcing her passage. The weight of the wood was real, a grounding force that pulled her back into her own body, out of the fog of grief. Copper would walk beside the cart, occasionally nudging her hand with his wet nose, a furry, four-legged shadow of encouragement. The pile of scrap wood behind her barn began to grow, a monument to her strange new obsession. The town of Hemlock Creek was a practical place built by people who valued utility above all else. A thing was either useful or it was not. A person either contributed to the town's survival or they were a burden. In this stark calculus, Annabelle's daily trips to the lumber mill made no sense. Her growing collection of scrap wood became a source of quiet amusement, then of open speculation. The whispers started in the general store, where the women gathered to trade news and provisions. Every single day, one would murmur over a sack of flour. "Pulls that cart like her life depends on it." For what? Splinters, another would add. Grief does strange things to the mind. The poor dear, the men were less sympathetic and more direct. Lounging on the bench outside the saloon, they'd watch her pass, the cart's squeaking wheel heralding her approach long before she came into view. "There goes the wood witch," one would chuckle into his beer. The nickname, meant to be cruel, spread through the town with the casual speed of gossip. Mr. Albright, a weathered rancher whose face was a roadmap of hard years and harder opinions, was the most vocal. He saw her efforts as an affront to common sense, a wasteful indulgence in a place where waste was a sin. One afternoon, as she passed his property, he called out from his porch, his voice laced with a gruff sort of pity. "You can't build a house from scraps, girl. And you can't burn 'em for heat. What in heaven's name are you doing with all that junk?" Annabelle stopped her cart. Copper let out a low, protective growl. She looked at the old rancher, at his stern, sun-creased face, and for a moment, the town's collective judgment felt like a physical weight, heavier than any load of wood. She had no answer for him, none that he would understand. She simply offered a small, polite nod and continued on her way, the squeaking wheel resuming its lonely song. Her silence was misinterpreted as weakness, as confirmation that she was lost in her sorrow. They did not see the focus in her eyes or the purpose in her stride. They saw a widow collecting trash. They did not see an artist gathering her paint. Only one person seemed to reserve judgment, her father-in-law, Mr. Hemlock. He was a man carved from the same quiet, resilient timber as the surrounding hills. He had lost his only son, and his grief was a vast, silent ocean next to her own. He never asked about the wood. He never commented on her daily trips. But one morning, Annabelle found the cart's wheel no longer squeaked, it had been expertly greased and tightened. Another evening, a basket of fresh eggs from his own hen sat on her porch. His love was a language of action, not words. He did not need to understand what she was doing in the barn. He only needed to know that she was doing something. He saw the work, and for him, that was enough. He was building a fence of quiet support around her, one that the town's mockery could not breach. Inside that fence, inside the barn, the real work continued, unseen and unimagined. The barn was her sanctuary. The moment she pulled the heavy doors shut, the noise of the world, the whispers, the judgments, the squeak of the cart's wheel, vanished. It was replaced by the private, focused sounds of her labor. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom through cracks in the siding. The air smelled of old hay, dry earth, and the accumulating scents of a dozen different types of wood. At first, the space was chaotic. The wood she brought back was simply added to the growing pile, a jumble of shapes and colors. But soon, a system emerged. She spent a full week just sorting. One corner of the barn became the domain of the pale woods, the creamy aspen, the nearly white pine, the soft gray of weathered cartonwood. Another corner held the reds and browns, the rich, warm cedar, the deep chocolate of walnut knots, the rust-colored heartwood of an old fence post. She created sections for texture, for grain, for pieces with unique, gnarled shapes. The pile kept growing, but it was no longer a pile. It was a library of possibilities. Her tools were simple, most of them Samuel's. A small handsaw, a rasp, a collection of knives for fine work, and blocks of sandstone for smoothing. Her first attempts were clumsy. She tried to create a simple geometric pattern on a small board, but the pieces didn't fit snugly. Gaps remained, and the glue she made from boiled animal hide was messy and weak. She left the failed attempt on her workbench, a reminder of the precision required. The collapsed piece wasn't a failure, it was a lesson in joinery. Weeks turned into a month. She learned to read the wood. She discovered that a twisted grain, while difficult to cut, created the illusion of movement. A dark knot could become an eye, a shadow, the heart of a storm. She began to work on a larger scale, claiming one entire wall of the barn as her canvas. She painstakingly affixed a backing of sturdy, flat planks, and on this surface, her vision began to take shape. It was a landscape. The rolling hills and distant buttes that surrounded Hemlock Creek, the very view from her cabin window. She used the pale aspen for the wide, endless sky, finding pieces whose grain suggested the wispy movement of clouds. The deep, weathered oak formed the dark, dramatic shadows of the canyons. For the sun-scorched earth of the prairie, she used 1,000 tiny slivers of pine and cartonwood, their varying shades creating a tapestry of light and color. Months passed. The sun of late summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of early autumn. Her hands became a record of her work. They were stained with wood sap, etched with a crosshatch of tiny cuts and splinters, the fingertips calloused and hard. She worked from dawn until the light failed, and then by the flickering, focused glow of a single lantern. Copper was her silent supervisor, his bed a pile of soft cedar shavings that filled the barn with a clean, comforting scent. He would watch her for hours, his head resting on his paws, a steady, breathing presence in the immense quiet. She was no longer just a widow. She was a creator, an architect of beauty from brokenness. She was taking the scraps of the world and piecing them together to make something whole. One Tuesday, the routine was broken. The stagecoach, which usually rumbled through town without stopping for more than a mailbag, lurched to a halt with the sharp crack of a broken axle. Stranded for a day or two were its passengers, among them a man named Mr. Sterling. He was an architect from Philadelphia, a man of refined tastes and quiet authority, dressed in a traveling coat that looked out of place against the town's dusty backdrop. He was on his way to see about a commission for a new territorial courthouse and was impatient with the delay. To pass the time, he sought out Mr. Hemlock, having heard he was the most skilled carpenter in the region, to inquire about sourcing local lumber. Mr. Hemlock, a man of few words, simply nodded toward his daughter-in-law's property. "The girl has wood," was all he said, the statement hanging in the air with deliberate ambiguity. Mr. Sterling, assuming he was being sent to a local timber seller, made the short walk to Annabelle's homestead. He found her not in the cabin, but in the barn, one of the great doors propped open to let in the afternoon light. He saw her from a distance first, a slight figure bent over a workbench, her dog asleep at her feet. He approached the opening and peered inside, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the dimness. What he saw stopped him cold. The air in his lungs seemed to freeze. He had expected stacks of raw planks. He was looking at a masterpiece. The entire back wall of the barn was a breathtaking mosaic, a sweeping landscape rendered in 1,000 shades of wood. It was vast, detailed, and alive with a kind of raw, elemental power he had never seen before. He saw the texture of the bark used to depict the rugged cliffs, the smooth, polished grain that formed a shimmering river, the chaotic jumble of splinters that created the impression of prairie grass bending in the wind. Annabel, startled by his shadow in the doorway, looked up. She saw a tall, well-dressed stranger staring, his mouth slightly agape. She felt a flush of shame, a sudden urge to hide her work, to cover it from this outsider's judging eyes. But Mr. Sterling's eyes held no judgment. They held a profound, professional reverence. He stepped inside, his polished boots silent on the dirt floor. He didn't offer empty praise or effusive compliments. Instead, he approached the wall and asked a question, his voice quiet with genuine curiosity. "How do you account for the wood's expansion in the summer humidity?" Annabel was taken aback. No one had ever asked her about her process. They only saw the what, not the how. She found her voice, hesitant at first. "I leave a small gap, almost invisible, between the larger pieces. And I cut the grain in opposing directions on the backing to prevent warping." He nodded slowly, running a gentle hand over a section of the mosaic. Brilliant. He moved along the wall, his gaze analytical and appreciative. He pointed to a section of sky. "Why this pattern here?" "The grain in that piece of aspen looked like wind," she replied simply. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "My dear woman," he said, his voice soft but firm, "what you are doing here is not craft. It is artistry of the highest order. You are not assembling pieces. You are painting with grain." He paused, letting his words settle in the quiet space. "The town's Founders' Day is next month. You must show them a piece of this. They need to see." The idea of displaying her work was terrifying. The barn was her private world, a place free from the town's pitying glances and skeptical whispers. But Mr. Sterling's words had planted a seed of courage. He was a man who understood structure and design, and he had seen value in her efforts. For the next few weeks, she worked on a smaller, portable panel. It was an intimate scene, not a grand landscape, a depiction of a lone cottonwood tree on a hill, its leaves 1,000 tiny, shimmering pieces of birch and aspen against a sky of pale pine. It was the tree she and Samuel had often sat under. She poured all of her skill and a good measure of her heart into the piece. Founders' Day arrived, a bustling affair of civic pride and communal celebration. The town square was filled with tables displaying prize-winning quilts, jars of preserved peaches, and intricately iced cakes. Annabel found a small, out-of-the-way spot and set up her panel on a simple wooden easel Mr. Hemlock had built for her. People ambled by, their attention focused on the more familiar, more traditional crafts. A few stopped to look at her panel, their brows furrowed in confusion. "Is that wood?" a woman asked, squinting at the piece. "My, how unusual!" The compliment was thin, a polite dismissal. A man peered closely and declared, "Clever what you can do with a bit of glue." They saw the material, the scrap wood, but they didn't see the art. They saw a curiosity, not a creation. Mr. Albright, the rancher, walked past with a group of his friends. He glanced at her panel, then at her, and let out a short, dismissive scoff. He didn't say a word, but his expression spoke volumes. She had brought her pile of junk into the town square. By midday, Annabel felt a familiar ache of loneliness settle over her. She had exposed a small piece of her soul, and no one had recognized it. They saw what they had always seen, the grieving widow with her strange hobby. The external validation she had secretly hoped for, the flicker of understanding Mr. Sterling had promised, failed to materialize. As the afternoon sun began to dip, she carefully wrapped the panel in a cloth and loaded it back into her cart. The squeaking wheel seemed louder on the journey home, each rotation a small cry of failure. Copper nudged her hand, sensing her disappointment. When she returned to the barn, she did not put the panel away in defeat. She unwrapped it and hung it on a nail near her workbench. She looked from the small, misunderstood panel to the magnificent, sprawling mural on the far wall. The town hadn't seen. But the work was not for them. It was for her. The failure in the town square was not an end. It was a clarification of purpose. She picked up a piece of cedar, its reddish grain like a captured sunset, and got back to work, the quiet snick of her knife the only sound in the growing twilight. A season turned. The gold of autumn deepened into the stark, quiet white of winter. Annabel worked by the warmth of a new wood stove Mr. Hemlock had helped her install in the barn, the single lantern casting a focused pool of light on her hands. One crisp afternoon, a new stranger arrived in Hemlock Creek. His name was Mr. Davies, and he was a photographer, a chronicler of what he called the authentic soul of the territories. He traveled with a wagon that served as a mobile darkroom, his large wooden camera and tripod his constant companions. He was not interested in formal portraits or grand scenery. He was looking for stories etched into the landscape and the faces of its people. He was immediately drawn to Annabel's barn. To his artist's eye, it was a perfect subject, a structure of beautiful decay, its weathered wood a testament to time and hardship. He approached Mr. Hemlock, who was mending a harness in his yard, and asked for permission to photograph the old building. Mr. Hemlock looked at the photographer, then at his daughter-in-law's property. He remembered the architect's awe and Annabel's disappointment after the fair. Without a word, he simply pointed toward the barn, where one of the doors was again ajar, letting out a sliver of warm, golden light. Mr. Davies made his way across the frozen ground, his boots crunching in the snow. He expected to find a dusty, empty interior. He peered through the opening, and the scene that greeted him was so unexpected, so powerfully beautiful, that he forgot to breathe. The far wall was nearly complete, a vast, shimmering tapestry of wood that seemed to glow in the lantern light. In the foreground, a young woman was bent over her work, a golden retriever at her feet, surrounded by organized stacks of wood that looked like a painter's palette. The air was still, reverent, like a church. This was not a picture of decay. This was a picture of creation. He knew, with the certainty of an artist recognizing a masterpiece, that he was looking at something extraordinary. He carefully backed away from the door, his heart pounding. He did not want to disturb the scene. He retrieved his equipment from the wagon, his movement slow and deliberate. He set up his tripod in the snow, framing the shot through the open doorway. He was capturing not just the art, but the artist in her element. The long exposure time required absolute stillness. He waited, patiently, for the perfect moment. He took several plates, capturing the grand scope of the mural and intimate details of Annabel at her bench. Only after he was satisfied that he had captured the essence of the scene did he approach the door and clear his throat softly. Annabel looked up, startled again by an intruder in her sanctum. Mr. Davies removed his hat, his eyes full of a respect that bordered on awe. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am a photographer. What you are doing in here?" "It is the most honest and beautiful thing I have seen in all my travels." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the mural one more time. "May I," he asked, his voice full of a humble, earnest plea, "share this with the world?" Months passed, and the harsh winter slowly relinquished its grip to a tentative spring. Annabel had all but forgotten the quiet photographer and his strange, boxy camera. Her life had settled back into its familiar rhythm, the morning trips to the mill, the long, focused hours in the barn, the quiet evenings with copper by the fire. The mural was finished. It covered the entire wall, a breathtaking panorama that captured the spirit of the land in its own substance. Then the first letter arrived. It was addressed simply to the wood artist. Hemlock Creek. The postmaster, a fussy man named Mr. Gable, had handed it to her with a curious frown. The letter was from a woman in Chicago who had seen a photograph in a popular illustrated magazine. She wrote of how the image of the barn and the wooden mural had moved her to tears, how it spoke of resilience and finding beauty in what is broken. Annabel was stunned. A week later, 3 more letters arrived. Then 10. Soon, Mr. Gable was delivering a small sack of mail to her porch every few days. The story of the widow of Hemlock Creek had captured the public's imagination. Mr. Davies's photographs, stark and beautiful, had been published with a short, poignant article, and they had spread like wildfire. The world, it seemed, was enchanted by the tale of a lone woman turning scraps into a masterpiece. The letters came from everywhere. Artists wrote to praise her technique and her vision. Farmers wrote of how she had captured the soul of the land they worked. Other widows wrote to share their own stories of grief and finding a new purpose. The town of Hemlock Creek was baffled by the sudden flood of attention. Finn, the sawyer, was shown a copy of the magazine by a traveling salesman. He stared at the photograph of the mural, then at the piles of scrap wood behind his mill, and shook his head in disbelief. The whispers in the general store changed from pity to awe. The men outside the saloon no longer made jokes, they spoke of her with a new, grudging respect. They had seen a woman hauling junk. The world was showing them a genius in their midst. Among the deluge of letters was one that stood out. It was written on heavy, cream-colored stationery and bore the seal of a prominent Boston architectural firm. It was from a woman named Mrs. Vance, a patron of the arts and the head of a committee overseeing the construction of a brand new city library. She wrote in language that was both poetic and direct. "You have captured the soul of the frontier in the very material it seeks to tame," she wrote. "Your work is not merely decorative, it is a narrative, a history written in grain." And not. The letter concluded with an astonishing offer, a commission to create a series of large panels for the library's main reading room, with a generous advance to cover her materials and time. The scrap wood had become a treasure. The lonely hobby had become a calling. The arrival of the bank draft from Boston was a surreal moment. Annabelle held the crisp paper in her hands, the sum written on it larger than any amount of money she had ever seen. It was real. The world was not only looking, it was investing in her vision. Her first act was to walk to her father-in-law's small house and hand him a significant portion of the money. Mr. Hemlock looked at the draft, then at her, his weathered face unreadable. He tried to refuse, but she insisted. "For everything," was all she said. He finally took it with a single, solemn nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of all the quiet support he had given her. Her second act was to transform the barn. It would no longer be a dilapidated shelter for a secret project. It would be a proper workshop. She hired Finn and 2 other men from the town to help. They didn't just patch the holes, they rebuilt it with care and respect. They put in new, larger windows on the south-facing wall, flooding the space with natural light. They laid a proper wooden floor over the packed earth. They reinforced the roof and installed organized shelves and bins that lined the walls, turning her chaotic but ordered piles of wood into a meticulously catalogued library of materials. The mural on the back wall was carefully protected during the construction, treated like the sacred object it had become. The townspeople who had once mocked her now vied for the chance to help, their earlier skepticism replaced by a fervent, proprietary pride. They were helping to build the workshop of their artist. When the work was done, the barn was transformed. It was the same structure, but it was now filled with light, warmth, and purpose. Above the newly painted doors, Mr. Hemlock had hung a simple, hand-carved sign that read, "The Hemlock Workshop." The name felt right. It honored the place and the family that had given her refuge. With a proper space and the resources from her commission, Annabelle's work entered a new phase. She began to work in a more organized fashion, developing what she called collections. The Prairie Collection consisted of landscapes, capturing the subtle, shifting colors of the grasslands through the seasons. The River Collection was more abstract, using the swirling, fluid grains of woods like cherry and maple to evoke the movement of water. And she began a private, deeply personal series she called the Memory Collection. These were smaller, portrait-like pieces. One was a tender, abstract rendering of Copper's sleeping form. Another, which she kept covered with a cloth and never showed to anyone, was her attempt to capture the memory of Samuel's smile, not his face, but the feeling of it, rendered in the warmest, most vibrant pieces of cedar she could find. Her art was no longer just a response to grief, it was an ongoing conversation with life, memory, and the enduring beauty of the world. One cool evening, as Annabelle was sweeping sawdust from the floor of her new workshop, she saw a figure approaching. It was Mr. Albright, the old rancher. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait, his hat held in his hands, his usual air of gruff certainty replaced by a profound humility. He stopped at the open doorway, his eyes scanning the transformed interior, the neat stacks of wood, the tools hanging in their proper places, and the soft light falling on the great mural. He stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. He finally said, his voice raspy and low. He cleared his throat and looked her directly in the eye. I came to apologize. Annabelle stopped sweeping and leaned on her broom, waiting. I saw junk, he said, his words simple and unadorned. I saw a poor girl wasting her time on trash. I was wrong. He shook his head slowly, his gaze returning to the mural. You saw. Well, you saw what was really there all along. I'm sorry for my foolishness. There was no malice in Annabelle's heart, no desire for retribution. She understood that he had seen with the world's eyes, and it had taken the world to show him a different way of seeing. She offered him a small, genuine smile and a slight nod of her head, an acceptance that needed no words. He nodded back, turned, and walked away, a man unburdened. The next morning, Finn arrived with his wagon. But instead of stopping at the scrap pile, he pulled right up to the workshop. The bed of the wagon was not filled with the usual offcuts. It was loaded with carefully selected planks of wood Annabelle had only ever dreamed of working with: dark, lustrous walnut, deep red cherry, and a piece of bird's eye maple that shimmered in the morning light. A gift, Finn said, his face beaming with pride. From some of us in town. We figured you might be tired of working with the hard stuff. He looked around at the finished workshop, its new windows gleaming. Looks different, he said, a note of wonder in his voice. Annabelle ran a hand over the smooth surface of the cherry wood, her heart full. She looked from the pristine new lumber to the mural on the wall, a masterpiece made entirely from wood no one else had wanted. It's the same, she replied softly. The form had changed, but the essence, the spirit of the work, remained. It was always about seeing the potential hidden within the discarded. Perhaps you have a barn of your own. A place in your life that looks broken down from the outside, a place that holds your own private griefs and secret, unfinished projects. And perhaps you have a pile of scraps, the failures, the mistakes, the disappointments, the pieces of your life that you or others have deemed worthless. The world may look at your efforts and see nothing but a strange hobby, a foolish waste of time. They may not understand why you collect these broken pieces, why you spend your hours sorting through memories and mending what has been cast aside. They see junk. But you see what is really there. You see the color in the sorrow, the texture in the hardship, the hidden beauty in the flaws. You see a palette of possibilities where others only see a pile of trash. The story of Annabelle and her barn is not just about wood. It is about the sacred, transformative power of seeing things not as they are, but as they could be. It is a reminder that the most profound creations often begin in the quietest, most overlooked corners of our lives, built from the very materials we were told to throw away. Your work may seem small and misunderstood. Your progress may be slow, marked by splinters and setbacks. But do not be discouraged by the judgment of the world. Stay true to the vision that only you can see. Keep gathering your scraps. Keep sorting, shaping, and piecing them together. For within that patient, loving work, you are not just building a project, you are rebuilding a life. You are creating something whole and beautiful from the fragments. And one day, the world may just knock on your door, not to mock, but to marvel. In the grand design of things, we are all given a pile of raw materials. Some of it is smooth and straight, and some of it is knotted, warped, and broken. We are not defined by the quality of the wood we are given, but by what we choose to build with it. Annabelle's story teaches us that there is no such thing as worthless material in the hands of a patient creator. Every scar, every flaw, every splinter has the potential to become part of a masterpiece. Her work was a prayer, an act of faith that beauty could be resurrected from what was seemingly dead. It is a powerful metaphor for the grace that finds us in our lowest moments. A divine hand that reaches into the scrap pile of our lives, picks us up, and sees not our brokenness, but our incredible, untapped potential. It is a promise that even from the deepest grief, a cathedral of hope can be built. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And let us know in the comments below about the scraps in your own life that you are learning to see as beautiful. May you have the courage to enter your own barn, the patience to work with what you have been given, and the faith to see the masterpiece hidden within the mess. Be well, and walk in grace.